Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 25 of my secular Bible study series, and today we are looking at Lamentations. What a unique little book. Many of you maybe are not that familiar with it. For one, it's only 5 chapters long. 2, you might have felt it was covering redundant territory, but let me just assure you that it's worth the while, at least in terms of fully understanding the entirety of the canon and how all of these books work together, why they were chosen, how they were placed, etc. Plus, this has some really unique themes and writing techniques and is an important part of understanding Israel's past or the beginning of this religion. So let's get into it with point 1, book overview. I think it's first important to understand what this book is exactly. This is not Torah. This is not one of the prophets. That leaves the writings or the Ketuvim. Within that group of writings, this would be considered one of the 5 scrolls. So with that, you have Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, Esther, and Lamentations. And I really like covering these kinds of books because they're so different than what we typically see. Granted, this one doesn't stand out as much as Ecclesiastes or Song of Solomon, etc., in terms of its difference, because it's just doubling down on a particular event and showing a grieving process, if you will. We see so many human emotions here. We see confusion and doubt and anger and hope and all kinds of things that happen to people as they move through a grieving process. In fact, the first poem is comparing really what happened to Jerusalem with the death of a loved one. It is that deep, sorrowful mourning for a sudden and horrific loss that is portrayed so well. So all of this is about the siege that just happened with Babylon. We covered it in Jeremiah, we covered it in 2 Kings. So you guys know about this event in great detail. If you don't know how horrific it is because you didn't make it all the way to point 7 in Jeremiah or point 7 in 2 Kings, please go back and watch one of those two now so you can understand the insanity that God inflicted upon his people for his just wrath. But as God would love to tell you, they had it coming. That's right. Every single person, every single woman, every single child, collective punishment. At least we get collective grief and mourning because this book has mourning for the individual and for the people in general. But it's made up of 5 poems, 5 chapters, 5 poems. It's really well structured. There's a lot of structure to the first 4 poems. It gets a little loose with the 5th one, and 3 of those 4 poems with structure follow the very same kind of poetic path. So we'll get into all of that when we get into point 4 with a literary analysis, but that's the breakdown of the book. It's very simple. What I will cover now for book overview is what you get from each of those 5 different poems, or what the main theme is. So we have Lamentations chapter 1. This is How Lonely Sits the City is how they've titled it, and you get a reference here to the city being a woman. In fact, we get this figure, Lady Zion, and she is referenced as a she, which we talked a little bit about this imagery of God and his people being that of a possessive, controlling husband and his bride. That's why it offends God so much, as some of these people were worshiping other gods, because God, as we know, his name is jealous. And when he views this entire people group and or city as his woman, who is supposed to be faithful to him, this affair, so to speak, cannot go unpunished. And so we see this kind of verbiage and energy, especially in this first poem. Her foes have become the head, her enemies prosper, because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away captives before the foe. And it goes on like that. It does mix metaphors a little bit because sometimes it calls her the daughter of Zion or Lady Zion. But either way, it is very particular and on purpose here that she has become a woman after her great sacking of Babylon because of her own flirtatious ways with the enemy. So that's the first poem. The second poem is more about God's justice. The word wrath is used here a lot, but wrath coming from their understanding was, well, they had it coming, their comeuppance. The Lord's just wrath, his justice. We get reminders here that God is slow to anger, but that eventually that anger boils over. That's the imagery that we are given in either Isaiah or Jeremiah. I can't remember. I think it was Jeremiah, where God's cup finally spills over with his anger, with his vengeance. And that's when he allows Babylon, if not straight up commands Babylon, to come and take his chosen people for 70 years and destroy their city and their temple. So yes, chapter 2 is so much about the destruction and the wrath. And then we get to chapter 3, and it's kind of this slight turn. This is the longest one. This does some of the technique a little differently than the others, but the main part of it is to recognize the extent of the suffering that has happened. I'll just read you a couple of the first verses. I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. And it's interesting here because you could read this a couple different ways. You could read this as skipping the middleman, and the person who's doing the lamenting is talking about what God has done to them, because this is God's divine plan for his people. Jeremiah warned about it. Jeremiah prophesied what God would do, not what Babylon would do. Yes, in part that Babylon would come and that this would happen, but because of God's anger, because of his wrath. But there's verses at the end where this person is begging God to go and get revenge for them. A lovely thing that happens in almost every book of the Old Testament. And so in that way, we can think that they've been talking to their oppressors, actual Babylon, this entire time. But I don't think we even need to make a distinction here. If we believe Jeremiah, we believe that God used Babylon as his very sword to go and deliver his judgment, his wrath and justice to his people. So crying out about the horrors of Babylon and what they did is the exact same thing as crying out that your God has done this to you. Chapter 4 is a really short one here, and it's really kind of this quick comparison of what the holy city used to be and the people in it were like versus what they are post-siege now that they have fallen. And it's an interesting kind of A-B, black and white, before and after comparison. And then 5 is where things change a little bit. The desperation kind of reaches its peak, its apex, and it becomes this cry for mercy and hope for myself, for the community. It is kind of the last big emotion or plea before God. And it ends very strangely, as many of these Old Testament books do. I'll read the last 4 verses. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us. The end. What a strange end. It might be one of the weirdest ends in the entire book. Contrast this with Jeremiah. Jeremiah takes us through all of this horror, but he ends with a tale of hope about King Jehoiakim being brought out of his captivity in Babylon to sit with the royalty at their table forever, which is kind of this promise from God that he has not forgotten his people and he does have an eventual plan for them. But in Lamentations, it is just, God, it seems like you forgot us. Don't you have a plan for us? Or maybe you don't. Maybe this time you have utterly rejected us. Maybe this time your anger stays. And I think that that is really interesting to think about coming from this people group that compiled these books during their captivity or shortly thereafter, and were trying to make sense of what had happened. You know, at this point, this is the worst thing that has happened to this people group. And a lot of bad things have happened to this people group. They were slaves for 400 years, if the stories are to be believed, but they were brought out of that slavery. But then they were cursed and they wandered for 40 years. But then they were given a promise land, but then they had to fight tooth and nail to conquer the people in their land and utterly destroy them. They went through a tribulation with the judges. They went through all the troubles of the monarchy and all of the different corrupt kings. Then they had a civil war. God punished them left and right. The northern kingdom had to deal with the Assyrians, and now the southern kingdom has been completely ransacked and taken. The temple destroyed. The people enslaved once again. Now, enslavement is different than captivity, but there's good reason to believe there was plenty of slave labor from those captives in Babylon. So you could argue maybe Egyptian slavery was the worst. I think because of what they had gained and the promises they thought they had been fulfilled, at least in their collective memory here of the oral traditions being passed down, they have lost so much. And now they're right back where they started, forsaken by their God. Thus is the story of Lamentations. That should do us for point 1. Let's move straight into point 2, which is authorship and date. This will be really quick. Many of these points will. So in terms of date, we know that this is after 586 BCE. This is someone, whoever wrote it, is someone who lived through the siege and the captivity to be able to record this. So it's just after the fact, but right after the fact, which is why many people think that the authorship would be Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. Now we have this huge weep, this lamenting, but many people say, no, it was just some other personal witness to the events because he doesn't write like Jeremiah. The style is completely different. There are some incongruencies. Also, many scholars think it's more of a communal grief, like a collection of different stories from people that they wanted to get in, and maybe one person or probably multiple people took them, compiled them, edited them, and put them into this poetic fashion. So we don't really know. Traditional authorship, again, goes to Jeremiah, and I think that that's kind of a safe thing to say, that at least he inspired this kind of writing, or it was similar to his experience. It kind of seems to have his tone, but again, for so many of the other reasons, it could go either way, and it just ultimately doesn't really matter. Point 3 is historical context, accuracy, and background. I would encourage you just to go back to 2 Kings or Jeremiah for the exact same thing here. We know all about the captivity. We know all about Babylon. We know about the destruction of the temple. We know a lot. There's some things we don't know. There's some things that don't add up, and there's some timeline issues, but I've explained all that much before. Let's move right into point 4, which I think is really interesting to talk about the literary technique. So the first thing, and I mentioned it in the intro, is that 4 of the 5 of these use an acrostic style of poetry, which is when you do the alphabet, right? You probably remember doing this in grade school. A, B, C, D. You have to start the line with it. This is for the Hebrew alphabet, obviously, and it does that in chapters 1 through 4. For 1, 2, and 4, it uses one verse for each letter. Very simple. For chapter 3, which is the longest, it uses 3 verses for each letter, thus why it's so long. That's also the one describing the suffering, and I think that it is very on purpose that that one gets triple the attention for the book of Lamentations. And then the 5th book is kind of the wild west of them. Anything goes. We're seeing highs and lows. There's no orderly pattern. There is nothing holding this together with the rest. It is like we ran out of trying to contain our emotions in this orderly fashion and process them properly. And now we're just pouring out, begging for hope, wondering if all is lost. Also, this funeral poetry or lamenting poetry was not uncommon for the ancient Near East. There's a whole litany of Mesopotamian city laments just like this, where individuals or a collection of people will mourn, will try to encapsulate their suffering in song and verse and narrative, etc. In terms of internal techniques used within these poems, we have a lot of parallelism. We get that mirrored or inverted order like the chiastic structure. We get a few good examples of intertextuality, where we are calling back on something that has happened in another book, the main one being the connection to Jeremiah and some of the prophecies there. And then because of that acrostic structure, it's believed that this was done usually right alongside with some kind of performative nature, some acting out. One of the reasons for acrostic structure was so that it was easier to remember, because you'd be reciting it, some kind of oral history telling. And like any good order of the day, they would have been more dynamic. They would have had kind of a song and dance to go with it, if you will. And again, it's just a way of allowing this people group to grieve, to fear, to wander, to hope, etc. Which brings us nicely to main themes. The first one is mourning and despair. We have to feel this loss. These people need to remember this loss so they're not doomed to repeat it again. If they serve a God that can be offended, and in his offense, when the covenant that he just kind of put on them is broken, he's going to do this, we need to make sure we recognize this and stop getting ourselves in this same hot water. We need to mourn it. We need to fully experience it. The second theme then would ideally be restoration, redemption, something like this. Again, within the 5 chapters, there's enough of this, but what if, but God don't forget, but please help, but come back. And I'm hesitant to even call it a theme because it is just a hope. So maybe hope is the theme, but we don't see God's redemption in this book. We don't see a glimmer of hope at the end like we typically do. All we have are these people's thoughts. You could maybe put like a third theme of divine justice in here. God has done what he said he's going to do. It was awful, like Jeremiah said it would be, and now here you are, mourning the repercussions of your sin. Moving on to point 6, where we look at its influence and its reception from the Jewish tradition. It really has just one place of importance, and that is in the day or ceremony or ritual of Tisha B'Av. Hopefully I'm not butchering that pronunciation, but it is read aloud in the temple, in the synagogues, to remember the destruction of both the first and second temple. This day of mourning, if you will. I'm not Jewish. I'm sure someone could explain it much better than myself, but I do know Lamentations is a part of that process. From the Christian tradition, Lamentations is usually just kind of skipped over. It's that whiny, weepy prophet that needed a second book to continue to cry about what God did when clearly the justice was needed. And again, this is kind of within like the view of how the Bible shapes it, not the reality of the situation. But Christians are like, yeah, this had to happen anyways because we need to get to Jesus and we need a savior and we need a new covenant because this wasn't for us, and this is what had to happen for God to graft in all Gentiles, et cetera, et cetera. And so, that's one take. There are other Christian takes that are just looking at Lamentations as a warning. God has divine justice. When his anger is fully wound up, his wrath is unleashed, and you don't want to be there. And they use it as a warning. I've heard Christians reference Lamentations when they are talking about the downfall of America and the destruction that God will bring to us using other countries, just like God often did, for us and our wicked ways. It just maps on so perfectly for the believer. 9/11 was all of them saying, look, this is God's wake-up call. And I'm sure they did the same thing with Pearl Harbor. They do it with school shootings now. Anywhere that there is tragedy in America, it is blamed on the sins of the non-believers, which is funny because if you really were going according to the text, he was punishing his people, the people he had a covenant with, for their sin. That doesn't mean that the Gentiles didn't get some horrific collateral damage when he was on the up and up with his people, but I digress, getting way off point. Let's move straight into point 7. I don't have a lot, right? Contradictions, there's not many. This is 5 chapters of someone being sad about what happened. There are some contradictions that we could pull out of here because we get references to God not being evil, but elsewhere we're told God created evil and that God did evil to Job. We could talk about the sins of the father being passed down generationally. We have contradictions about that applying here, and the multiple times in other books that God has said he will do this or he will not do this. So there are things we could point to, but I think for what it is, we're just going to leave that alone, and we're going to maybe look at some problematic passages and call it a day. Let's grab the Bible and dive in. I know one of them that I noticed right away when I was rereading it before putting this episode together, sorry, I cannot do 2 things at once apparently, was at the end of Lamentations 3. This is verse 64 through 66. You will repay them, O Lord, according to the work of their hands. You will give them dullness of heart. Your curse will be on them. You will pursue them in anger and destroy them from under your heavens, O Lord. So just like I covered in Jeremiah, we get these prayers for destruction of the enemy, even though the enemy was just doing what God had orchestrated for them to do. But listen to the terminology here. You'll give them dullness of heart. That is affecting their will. The heart was really believed to be the brain at this time where the thinking happens. So dullness of heart would be like a cloudy mind. Sometimes heart is used in the same metaphorical way that we use it today about like the love center. So filling them with dullness of heart is just taking away their free will. Your curse will be on them. This is something I don't think we talk about enough. God literally curses. Like in the same way you think about witches and spells and generational curses and things like this, it's all from God. The fact there's sin and death in the world is a curse. Death is a curse. Like, have you thought about that? We started out supposedly as creatures that can't die. Then the first 2 that ever could messed up, and we are given a curse to die. Women are given a curse to feel pain in childbirth. Men are given a curse to have to work, to provide. Work, pain, death, all curses. I just think it's something that deserves more attention. Maybe we'll make a standalone episode about it. And how does God pursue these people when he puts his wrath upon them? In anger to destroy them. What about in sad but yet still graceful love, he rebukes them? No, in anger, he destroys them. Like, good father? I don't think so. That's just one verse. Let's see if there's any others here. Let's go back here to a little more at the beginning, 2:20. Look, O Lord, and see, with whom have you dealt thus? Should women eat the fruit of their womb, the children of their tender care? Should priests and prophets be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity. So again, these are the people kind of working out their issue with God. Like, how did you really let this happen? You let good, holy men be killed in the place of worship, in where it was holy. You let little women and children die by the sword. You let many others die of starvation so that the people still alive, like their parents, would have to eat their young just to survive another few days of terror and or then captivity. And I just love how straightforward this is. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity. Do Christians just not read the Bible? Let's do another one. Let's do 3:42. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have wrapped yourself with anger and pursued us, killing without pity. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can pass through. You have made us scum and garbage among the peoples. This one is doubling down on the last one, and I think it's interesting because, again, we hear that God is anger and that he is killing without pity, but we get an addition here about how God has even chosen to not hear their prayers. This could be another, of course, contradiction within the internal consistency of the Bible, because we are told this God never changes, and we are told that God always hears prayers. At least that's claims from the New Testament. The people in the Old Testament did not believe this, and we'll get into that more during our Dissecting the Divine series, but God in the Old Testament had to be beseeched. He had to be found. He had to be drawn close. He had to have his ear bent down to hear over the raucous of heaven and all of the angels shouting all of the wonderful things. It was hard to get God's attention. But here we're being told that he straight up wrapped himself in a cloud so that he could not hear. We saw this in Jeremiah also, where God just refuses to hear prayers. Except in Jeremiah, it's God telling the people, don't even bother. I'm not going to listen. Let's just keep moving through. Let's go to chapter 4, verse 9. Happier were the victims of the sword than the victims of hunger, who wasted away, pierced by lack of the fruits of the field. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food during the destruction of the daughter of my people. So again, the admittance of God purposely forcing cannibalism. This is part of God's curse. He lays it out in Jeremiah. You will do this. I will make sure that you have no other option but to do this. And why? Not just for your own sin, but as a warning to anyone that would walk by and see you. God is again a nasty, nasty mob boss trying to prove a point. And then again, we get the recognition of how horrific the starvation period was. The people who died initially by the sword, they're the lucky ones. I'm skipping so much, by the way. I mean, there is just horror and terror everywhere. Just for fun, I want to point out chapter 5, verse 7. Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Slaves rule over us. There is none to deliver us from their hand. These two verses say a lot. First of all, slaves rule over us now that Babylon has taken us, because what did the chosen people get to do? They got to enslave any nation around them, buy slaves from any neighbors, just not within their own community. Unless you trick them in through the indentured servitude clauses about your wife and or your children then getting to stay forever, and if you want to be with them, you have to remain a slave. But I digress. Even with God's wrath upon them, they still have positioned themselves better than the others, better than the enemy. It's now slaves that will rule us. I just think that that's like an added level of ridiculousness. And here we see our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. And yet, God has many times before this promised he will no longer punish the children for the sins of the father. The inconsistencies, the unfairness, the contradictions, and the disgusting nature of God's punishment in these quick 5 chapters should be enough to just throw the whole thing out. I could go on, but I won't. You can read it for yourself. It'll take literally just a few minutes to get through the 5 chapters, and you can see it all firsthand. So that's it. Thanks so much for being here. Excited that we are making it so far through the series. We have some of the major prophets coming up with Ezekiel and Daniel. I'm excited to cover those. So until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, Karolina, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Rokkit, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine patrons. Thanks, and have a great day.